Jesus was a Muslim, and here's why. The word Muslim means one that is surrendered or submitted to God. And what did the many works of Jesus do? He says, I can do nothing of myself. I can only do the will of the Father. I of myself can do nothing, but only from the Father who sent me. And he said, when he was at the Mount of Olives or Garden of Gethsemane, he said, Father, please taketh this cup from me, but overall, your will be done. He didn't choose his own will. He only did the will of the Father. This is the definition of what a Muslim is.
This is the definition of what a Muslim is.
Nope.
All right. Well, I officially feel dumber having watched that.
Yeah.
All right.
If you notice, he went to a Wikipedia page and then he ignores the definition and goes to the part where it says how it translates as submitters to God linguistically. He says the word Muslim means you submit to God. That's not what the word means. He has made up a definition based on its linguistic heritage, therefore claim that that's what the actual definition, which is false.
If you just saw me like gorging myself with food one day, like it's Ramadan, right? And you were to say, suppose you were to say, David, what are you doing? You're overeating. Stop doing that. And suppose my response was, I'm in the United States of America. I have a right to overeat. And I believe that I should always do what's right. Now, notice I used the word right twice. Even though it's the same word, those have two different meanings. It's very different to say I have a right to do something. That's very different from saying it's morally right. So if I used that as my defense, you could say, David, that's an equivocation. That is not a good defense of gorging yourself.
Collins Dictionary. Okay, a Muslim is someone who believes in Islam and lives according to its roles.
When you say Jesus is a Muslim, that will be understood by your listeners in a certain way. They will think you're saying that Jesus is an adherent of the religion of Islam, and not that you're just making some point about the meaning of a word or something, a technical meaning of a word, and does it anyway, knowing that when people say, here, Jesus is a Muslim, they think Jesus is an adherent of the religion of Islam. They can read 100 verses in a row that completely contradict Islam. And then the 101st verse is something that could agree with Islam. And they'll say, see, this entire passage is conclusive proof that Islam is true. Let me give Philippians 2 here just as an example of Christian theology. So this is Philippians 2, starting at verse 5. Paul says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God. Now notice he's in nature God, or in the form of God, depending on the translation, but he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Now notice here, so he's somehow God and somehow distinct from God. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Notice, he's in nature or in the form of God, but he makes himself nothing and takes the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God, now that's interesting because again, Jesus is God and yet somehow distinct from God. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord, but there's also God the Father, and Jesus is distinct from God the Father. How did Jesus appear as a man? Well, he took on the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. So once Jesus has taken on a human form, he is a servant. And what's interesting in all of this is that any Muslim who reads about Jesus being a servant will say, you see there, he's a Muslim. He's a Muslim. He's a servant. He's a servant of God. Not realizing, guys, we agree he's a servant. If you take the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the incarnation, and the Son becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, he is then a servant. You can't just say, here's something about him in that situation that confirms Islam. Therefore, Christianity is false because Christianity views him as God. He became incarnate and became a servant, ladies and gentlemen. So that's not inconsistent with God. We believe that. We believe he was a servant.
Also, John is very, very one of the most blatant books in the Bible that shows Jesus as God. We'll talk about places like John 8:58, John 14, Jesus appearing to Thomas, very first chapter of John. Like to use verses out of John to try to argue Jesus didn't claim to be God is one of the most ridiculous things I've seen. It's just a clear example of quote mining.
Yeah, the book literally begins by calling Jesus God, and then culminates with Thomas confessing him as my Lord and my God. Somehow they'll just see the parts where Jesus distinguishes himself from the Father in some sense. They'll focus on those and say, "You see, he's not God." This is one of the clearest places in the Bible among the quotes that Muslims use, where they're just obviously, as you pointed out, quote mining. The entire passage can completely contradict Islam. They will zero in on one part that, once it's completely taken out of context, can be twisted into something supporting Islam, and they'll say, "Here's the proof." Zakir Naik quotes John 5 over and over and over again. But look at what actually happens. Let's go ahead and start a couple verses earlier, and we'll do something they never do. We'll finish verse 19. They only quote the first part of verse 19. They ignore the second part of verse 19. Why? Because it completely contradicts Islam. They literally cannot finish a verse that they're quoting because it contradicts Islam. Earlier in this passage, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to be doing work on the Sabbath, and they viewed even healings as work. Watch how Jesus replies. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." So notice that already sounds like a claim to divinity. Human beings are not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. Jesus says, "The Father is working, so I'm working too." This is my goodness, this is the passage that Muslims are going to quote. That really sounds like he's putting himself in the category of God, not of ordinary human being or even prophet.
In its cultural context, yeah, it's as John says in the next verse, he's making himself equal with God.
In its cultural context, this isn't the same today because, someone's like my sons might go off and do anything, and it might be completely unrelated to what I do. But back in that context, you generally did what your dad did, right? If your dad is the butcher, you become the butcher because that's what you're going to be raised to be. If your dad is the carpenter, you end up being the carpenter. And so for someone to say that God is his father who's working and he's doing it, it's like he's saying, "Hey, I'm carrying on the family trade here, but that's the work of God and not just random stuff." He's talking about even working on the Sabbath. But verse 18, "This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own father, making himself equal with God." That's how they understood his claim. "Hey guys, I get to work on the Sabbath unlike you because my father does." And so this presents a problem for the Muslims. They had their sons by the tons response, where they say, "Oh, okay, even if Jesus calls himself the son, there are tons of sons of God in the Bible. Sons by the tons." Yeah, you can be a son of God in multiple senses. Don't commit an equivocation here, our Muslim friends, because as Jesus is using the son, he is the unique son. He's the divine son. So they understood him by saying that he can work on the Sabbath because his father's working. They understood him to be calling God his own father, making himself equal with God. But notice there's a problem here. He's making himself equal with God. It sounds like they think he's calling himself a second God who's equal to God. And what does Jesus do? He corrects this misunderstanding that he's claiming to be some sort of second God, some alternate God. So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord." You see there? The Son can do nothing of his own accord. Jesus is helpless. They stop there. The Son can do nothing of his own accord. You see, he's just a helpless servant. He's a helpless prophet. But notice, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise. What? Muslims, can any Muslim in history say, "Whatever Allah does, I do all the exact same things"? No. They'll leave off the second part of the verse. Even you've got this father-son language, and then this is clearly not a son of God in the sense that, oh, we're all children of God. It's not talking like that. This is whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. That's what happens when we actually look at the context of one of these passages that these guys quote. What is Jesus actually saying in John chapter 5, verse 30? What was the accusation against him? Because he said that since the Father works, he gets to work too. The accusation was, you're claiming to be another God, claiming to be another equal with God. Jesus' response is, what are you talking about? His claim is that he's not some separate God. He's one. He's one with the Father. You treated John chapter 5 as evidence that's either going to confirm Christian theology or Muslim theology. What should we expect Jesus to affirm? We should expect him to affirm that he is divine, that he has a divine nature, but that he has entered creation as a servant, and that he is distinct from the Father, and yet he's not a separate God from the Father. That's what you would expect Jesus to affirm if Christian theology is true. If Islamic theology is true, Jesus is just a created prophet. Allah's a father to no one. No one is a son of God. Allah's the one who judges people at the final judgment. Allah's the one who raises the dead. And Jesus is, he's just a mere servant. Which theology is being confirmed there? Massive confirmation for Christian theology, massive disconfirmation for Islamic theology. What do Muslim da'is do? They go to the one part, I can of my own self do nothing. They focus just on that, they ignore everything else, and they say, see, this affirms Islamic theology. Guys, is that a good method? I regard that as like insanely, massively deceptive.